Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. I'm Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the nonprofit Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius Podcast. In late 2016, I was rear-ended at 65 miles an hour by a truck on the highway, which sent me off-road into a ditch. The impact of the collision gave me a concussion and other injuries. At the hospital, a CT scan showed that I had thyroid nodules, which turned out to be cancer. It was then, when I had a biopsy of my neck, that I realized even if I was a millionaire, I wouldn't want a second or a third biopsy due to the pain and the invasiveness of it. And appointments at that time for thyroid experts were 3 to 6 months out. And I was worried about dying now, even if that was irrational. So because of this, I've decided to raise money to conduct a literature review on steroids, on the causes of anxiety and depression, a condition that affects well over 50 million people in the United States and hundreds of millions worldwide. Our goal is to create a codex, a guide that reveals all possible treatments for anxiety and depression for people that live with the condition, or for loved ones that have it, as my wife and my son do. To find out more about our fundraiser, visit findinggeniusfoundation.org and click on current initiatives. And now, to our guest.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius podcast, now part of the Finding Genius Foundation. Today I have Robb Wolf. He's a former research biochemist. He's a 2 times New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestselling author of the Paleo solution, and now Wired to Eat. So we're going to talk about his latest work. So Robb, thanks for coming back.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, tell me a bit about your background. How did you get into the world of health and diet and fitness?
It's a long story. I'll try to keep it brief, but I've always been interested in health, human performance and whatnot. Had a pretty significant health crisis myself 20 plus years ago. I had ulcerative colitis so bad that I was facing either a bowel resection or immunosuppressant drugs or a combination of those. And it was kind of I'm 5'9", about 170 pounds. At the low ebb of my ulcerative colitis, I was about 125, 130 pounds. So I was pretty rough shape. And it was kind of an act of desperation that this idea of, an ancestral diet or a paleo type diet got on my radar. And it's kind of an interesting story how I came to that, but I tinkered with it. It was hugely beneficial for me. And I started working with a lot of people. Not too long after that, I found this weird workout online called CrossFit and ended up going on to co-found the first and fourth CrossFit affiliate gyms in the world. And so had this opportunity to work with, people from all walks of life. I worked for a number of years with the Naval Special Warfare Resiliency Program, working with the SEALs, the special boat teams and their families, all the way to just schleps like myself who have these complex autoimmune and gut related issues. And that's kind of what I've been doing the past 23 years. There's been a lot of other twists and turns along the way, but it was kind of a personal health crisis that launched me into this scene. I was very early in the CrossFit, world, and got to kind of ride along with that and have worked with a pretty wide variety of people along the way.
Well, very good. So have you settled in that, I guess the paleo diet is really the optimal one that you found for yourself and for others? Or in terms of diet and food intake, what's your current, your most recent perception of what works for people?
What works for people is hugely varied. I think that a paleo type template is a really nice restart, because if you have somebody that has eaten a pretty terrible diet their whole life, like, they were raised on stuff that comes out of boxes and bags and cans, and they just have absolutely no basis for what, sound nutrition looks like. Some sort of a lowish carb paleo type thing is a pretty good reset. It's a pretty good place to just kind of wipe the slate clean and get started again. And then, from there, I have found a bit of a universality that if people eat adequate protein, they tend to reasonably easily maintain good body weight, good body composition, pretty good metabolic health. And then from there, if we figure out with folks whether they run better on some fat or some carbs or a combo, that's kind of the way that I've whittled things down these days. But, if there's one universality that I do tend to see, it's that people who struggle with body composition and like appetite control and whatnot, they pretty universally are under-eating protein. And that has a tendency to allow them to overeat everything else.
Okay. So what is this Wired to Eat concept and book? What's it about?
Wired to Eat was my second book, and it really digs into the neuroregulation of appetite. And I guess the book is kind of two-pronged different from my first book. The first part is really laying out this case for personalized nutrition and personalized, response to different foods. And the second part is a really quantifiable way of testing foods using a blood glucose monitor to see how folks respond to individual foods and also, a given meal. And so it really builds off the next 10 years of my, I guess, career, my work, figuring things out, working with lots of folks. But the two big parts to that is just some recognition from the scientific literature that there's a remarkable range of responses that folks can have to different foods. I could eat a cup of rice and have nearly diabetic blood sugar levels. My wife could eat the same cup of rice and her blood sugar barely budgets, which is far preferable, but I'm not her. So I need to find ways of eating that are different. And so, it's a recognition of that individuality, and then also provide some framework using blood glucose monitors so that people can individualize and customize their nutrition to really, really dial it in for their specific needs.
Yeah. Why do you think there's such variation in people? What are the underlying reasons or possible reasons?
That's a really great question. And some research that came out of the Weizmann Institute in Israel, they looked at genetic factors, epigenetic factors like our gut microbiome, some different blood lipid considerations and whatnot. But there seems to be an interplay between our genetics and then the way our genetics are modified over a lifetime, like the number of times we've taken antibiotics, if our vitamin D status is adequate, if we exercise or are sedentary. So, there's the genetic piece, probably the gut microbiome piece. And then another big factor is physical activity. I think that if all of us were able to go for a 20-minute walk after a meal, it would clean up a lot of the, and this isn't a calorie thing, it's a hormonal thing. It's facilitating the storage of glucose without huge amounts of insulin, the storage hormone that usually helps us to manage blood glucose levels. But I think a little bit of physical activity, factored in with genetics and epigenetics are kind of the big factors that, modify how somebody responds to a given meal, at least from a glycemic perspective.
What are the limits of variation that you've observed? Like, what is not good for anybody that you've seen? And what is good for, I don't know, has there been any curious foods or diet plans that are good for a very, very small amount of people, and some that are good for nobody, and some that seem to be good for most people?
I would say that liquid carbohydrates, like, sugary beverages, juices, sugary coffee drinks, those are pretty uniformly bad. And, and I'll really backstop that with the following. 20 years ago, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. This is where the liver basically becomes marbled and a block of fat, and it dies. It becomes non-functional. This was unheard of in children 20 years ago. And this is one of the most rapidly increasing metabolic diseases. Like it is an epidemic of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And where this ends up ultimately is the individual either needs a liver transplant or they're going to die. And so we've seen this explode within, youthful populations. And one of the most prominently, changed features of the diet is that kids just consume huge amounts of liquid sugar. And so I think that that's one that is just about universally a bad move. All the parents that are taking their kids to like youth soccer and the kids kind of scratch around in the grass for 45 minutes. Little Jimmy doesn't need a 32-ounce Gatorade after that. Like he barely broke a sweat. He hasn't even finished usually digesting the bowl of cereal, the toast, and the juice that he was fed at breakfast. And so, but just being very aware that dietary liquid carbohydrate is a bad move. On the the kind of weird and wacky stuff.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
Thing with that is that just about anything will work or will be an improvement for at least someone at some point. If somebody has been eating very, very poorly and they have terrible sleep and they're on shift work and they're drinking tons of liquid carbohydrates and they're basically type 2 diabetic, becoming non-alcoholic, fatty liver, and they have gout. There's almost nothing that person could do that wouldn't make things better. If they do the cabbage soup diet or they, eat 1 cookie a day diet, there's almost no way they can screw that up. They're doing literally everything wrong that one could imagine and criticizing them, but it's just kind of the reality. So almost anything will work initially, particularly if the individual is pretty far gone. But the real challenge is sustainability. There is a reality that everybody in this health space faces. Most people don't stick to or succeed long-term with, weight loss and dietary changes. It's a very small number of folks who do. I forget the stats off the top of my head. I think I have them there in the beginning of Wired to Eat, but it's something like 140 million Americans, like half of America starts a diet each year. And on average, most of those people retry it 4 to 5 times within the year. And compliance and sticking to it is just remarkably challenging.
So, you've been in this game for a long time. What is some of the newest changes in perception you've had, or some of the newest nuances about what you do and what you know, what you see in people?
Really good question. Definitely the acknowledgement that each person is different and that even the needs of an individual will change over time. So I did have the opportunity to work with a good number of Navy SEALs as part of the Naval Special Warfare Resiliency Program. And it was interesting to see those guys, very tough, very robust, hard to break them. But when they would start doing deployed, night ops where they're awake all night wearing night vision goggles, and then they sleep during the day and use Ambien to go to sleep, and then some Go pills to wake up and get going. It was interesting that I would see dietary issues emerge because of the stress of deployment. So say the individual has no problems with wheat or gluten while they're stateside and their lives, although, complex, are relatively lower stress. But then as the stress level ratchets up, the ability for that person to tolerate the, dairy or gluten or some other thing may decrease because it's a low level irritant that isn't a big deal until it becomes a big deal because, the stress load of their whole life ends up catching up with them. So I think that's maybe one of the biggest things that I've seen is just that, the variability from person to person is rather large. And then the variability of what works for an individual, situation to situation can also be pretty remarkable.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
So what new concepts are you advancing in your Wired to Eat? What are the new things that you're trying to convey to people?
I'm making folks aware of the neuroregulation of appetite as one of the big, cornerstones and takeaways within that. And it's interesting. I reference a TV show. It's called Man vs. Food. Adam Rickman was on it. and he would do these eating challenges, and the one that I highlight is called the kitchen sink ice cream sundae challenge, where the person is served literally an ice cream sundae in a kitchen sink, and it's like 8 pounds of ice cream and, condiments and everything. And if you finish eating this thing in some allotted time, then you win some prize. I'm not really sure what the prize is, but Adam gets down to working on this thing, and he's maybe a third of the way through, and you can see the guy starting to turn green and gagging, and he's just like bottomed out on, as good as an ice cream sundae could be, 8 pounds of it are going to become hell. And so what he does to finish this challenge is fascinating, and it gives registered dietitians aneurysms, like their brain just doesn't wrap around this stuff, because what he ends up doing is he orders a plate of extra salty, extra crunchy French fries. And these French fries are salty, crunchy, umami. They're as different from the sweet, cold, sugary creaminess of ice cream that you couldn't get two more different, kind of flavor exposures. But what he starts doing is he eats a couple of French fries, takes a bite of ice cream, eats a couple of French fries, takes a bite of ice cream. And so he's able to complete this challenge by eating more food. And this is what blows people away. He would have failed to eat the ice cream had he not also had the ability to eat the French fries too.
I remember you told me an example of this one packaged food. It wasn't popcorners, but it was something like that. And you actually either figured it out or
Doritos roulette. Yeah, Doritos roulette.
Yeah. Can you talk about wherever you feel like you want to insert it? I guess also insert that too.
Yeah, so I mean, our diets writ large are more like a buffet than not in a lot of ways, especially when you consider our evolutionary biology and how simple our food consumption would have been in the past. So when we have the ability to eat these really complex, multi-flavored, multi-textured, meals, it's very, very easy to overeat. And that it's really well illustrated with that Man versus Food show. The genius from the food manufacturing side is seen with this Doritos roulette product, which is an iteration of the classic, Dorito chip, which are amazing. They're delicious. But what they did with this is they have a spicy version, and it's not uniformly spicy. Some of them are mild, some of them are medium, and a very few chips are like super, super hot. And when you look at this from like an addiction perspective and also from a neuroregulation of appetite perspective, the mixing of the flavor and the palate experience is perfect for encouraging people to eat more, because each chip isn't exactly like the one that you had before. And the extremely hot ones are so hot that you almost get a little bit of like anxiety around the thing. Heart rate goes up. You're like, oh man, when's the hot one really going to drop? And this is right in line with what we see with like, when somebody shoots heroin or something, like there's a whole ritual before the process and a ritualization and habituation process to it, that if we get into some of the neuropharmacology or neurophysiology, like it really releases dopamine, which entrains this kind of habit, the habit forming element to this. So I did reach out to the folks who made this product, and I asked them a little bit of details, and they were actually rather forthcoming with it, which was surprising. But it's a genius from a food manufacturing perspective. But the irony is that most of what we've talked about on the show thus far is really well known, really well understood within, say, like the manufacturing food circles, the people who are making the junk food that makes us sick. None of this stuff is controversial. All of it is very well understood. But yet, if you go to talk to your doctor about the neuroregulation of appetite and, mixed palate experience and stuff, they'll look at you like you have 6 heads. And it's kind of a tough thing to get any buy-in from those folks.
So why did that person's strategy of eating the French fries and then going back to the ice cream work? And why does this Doritos roulette work to get people to consume it so much?
The changing in the palate experience, like just a change. We tend to have some remarkably interesting kind of neural circuitry where even if we're eating something that we enjoy, we will experience what's called palate fatigue. We'll just get bored of whatever the item is. And there's some good wiring for this. Like any type of food can be toxic if overconsumed. And so if you get bored of it, there will be less likelihood of, getting a toxic dose from something. And then also just from a nutrient profile, as good as blueberries are, blueberries don't provide full, complete nutrition. So if you had a big bowl of blueberries, that's great, but it wouldn't be a bad thing to get, a bit bored with them, because it would encourage you to eat some other things, and then you're more likely to get, truly full, complete nutrition. And so that's the reason why it worked for Adam Rickman, was he was switching up this palate experience. He reached the point where he was nearly going to vomit from the ice cream sundae, but then because he was able to mix up this experience, and the estimate that he had was that the plate of French fries was somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 calories. Like, it was a huge plate of French fries. That's basically a daily caloric allotment for most people that he ate on top of this huge sundae, which I don't know. There was probably 8,000 calories in that sundae, but it's again, worth mentioning, he would have never finished that sundae without, those French fries there. And then to the Dorito roulettes, they're just taking advantage of this understanding of palate fatigue and novelty, the fact that if we change up our eating experience, that we're more likely to eat more food.
So in instructing people on what to eat and what not to eat, again, how does this change what you tell them, what to watch out for?
At a really basic level, just making folks aware that highly complex meals can be easily overeaten. And, one of the strategies is to just try to focus on somewhat simpler meals. Like, I have this thing called the food matrix, which is I have a list of 5 proteins, 5 veggies, 5 different cooking oils, and then 5 spices. And within that 5x5 matrix, there's 225 different meal options. And, you've got like chicken plus broccoli plus olive oil plus ginger, chicken plus broccoli plus olive oil plus garlic, and it just goes from there. So finding ways to get enough variety so that we don't go crazy because we're eating a really monotonous, set of meals, but also not so much variety that we have a tendency to overeat.
What are the remaining holes in terms of understanding nutrition? It seems like so many people have written about it, so many people have talked about it, that I guess you would think everything has been discussed, but what do you see are really the holes in the knowledge of nutrition nowadays?
We'd never probably need to learn anything more about the mechanisms, biochemistry of nutrition, metabolism. Like, I don't know that there's really anything to be gained there. The real challenge is adherence and buy-in. And, that's where motivational interviewing, figuring out readiness for change, like it's really the implementation side is where all this stuff falls down. There's a very, very few people who will pick up one of my books, read it, and then do it and like really do it and succeed. There's a few people that do that, but it's of the population at large, only a few of them are, willing to buy a diet book, and it far, an even smaller, fractional percentage are actually doing what's recommended there. If you get some sort of health coaching, even things like the Weight Watchers and Jenny Craig and stuff like that, they work far better over the long haul than somebody just picking up a book. And it depends on a couple of factors, like the more actual human interaction that somebody has, the better, interaction they have with a coach and somebody that's supporting them. That is a huge, piece of whether or not somebody's going to succeed or fail in something like this. There have been a zillion different apps with billions of dollars invested in them trying to, create some sort of Facebook-like, hands-off interaction that helps people lose weight and get healthy, and none of them work. Like, again, it's a person here, a person there. They'll find it helpful. It improves their situation just enough. But at the end of the day, that person was ready to just succeed almost no matter what. And the little tool that an app provided is kind of trivial at that point. But people are still struggling. They don't have a deep reserve of self-control and whatnot. Their success really hinges usually on some sort of a group support program. This is where things like CrossFit can be kind of handy, martial arts and whatnot. Like, you're doing something where there's a community component to it and your performance kind of matters. And so you're motivated to stick with it and do that. And then the next piece to that is some sort of health coaching.
I guess the environment in which we all live, I'm out a lot. So I notice, all the food around you is usually fast food or, like prepackaged stuff. It just everything around you, like the entire environment, the commercials, what the ads you see on your phone, people around you, the food around you, just everything is conspiring to get you to eat one way. And then I guess all you have on the other side of the equation is your knowledge and your willpower to eat right. So I guess that's probably why most people lose.
Yeah. And I mean, that's why my second book was titled Wired to Eat, because we are wired to eat more and move less. Like, that's good evolutionary wiring. And now, though, we live in a world where we can get food delivered to our front door. We don't have to lift a finger, virtually to get it. And so that plays so poorly, and not just any food, but we can get this massive variety of food that is engineered to taste really amazing. And that's a hell of a thing to fight against. Our basic tendency is to eat more food and move less, because that's the reason why humanity is still here. That, people did that strategy in the past, but that strategy now is just very maladaptive, because we're by and large, wealthy enough and have the infrastructure to have access to what is effectively unlimited food for most people.
I think there's also decision fatigue, because I realize, like, every day, 3 to 5 times a day, you're confronted with, oh, am I hungry? Maybe I should eat something. And then what am I going to eat? So if you have to make a decision, the right decision every day, multiple times a day, chances are you're going to make it wrong at least some of the time.
Yeah. And you know what, when you asked me about some of the trends in this space, I gave you a short thrift on that. Intermittent fasting or time restricted eating is a viable tool, and it kind of addresses that decision fatigue a little bit. And decision fatigue is a real factor in this. Parents, people who have shift work and whatnot, like they're if you're tired, your decision fatigue is just massive. If you've already made a lot of big decisions, but a lot of people are unwilling to change what they eat. They're not really going to clean up the composition, at least not initially. But telling people, hey, if you just eat between the hours of, say, like 10 a.m. and 4 p.m., but you can eat whatever you want during that time. A lot of people can do that, and a lot of people find that a viable place to start. And there's nothing magic to it. It's just introducing some calorie restriction, giving your body a chunk of time to not be eating constantly and to offload some of those calories. But it does work well. And then if you get that person who is only eating between like 10 a.m. and 4 p.m., you're like, hey, when you eat, try to eat protein first and eat that until you're like tired of the protein, then eat the other stuff. And if you can get people doing that pretty quickly, you can find folks that have organically kind of grown into their own style of eating that is kind of protein forward, which is good, has some calorie restriction due to both the protein intake and the time restricted nature of their eating. And that can work really well. And I am seeing that as a strong and viable tool within this kind of emphasis on change.
What kind of time window? I know there's probably an optimal, maybe there isn't, but with eating, it seems like if you go 80% of the way, you get some benefit. But I have the feeling that if you go 100% of the way on certain things, you get massively more benefit. So like if I'm going to do time restricted eating and I do 12 on, 12 off, what would I get versus 16 off, 8 on? And then with food too, like if I totally eliminate something versus just have it a little bit, what difference would you expect to see in someone's health?
Yeah, it's tough because if it's 12 on, 12 off, let's just, to make the numbers kind of easy, maybe it's 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. we're fasting. If the individual sleeps, say like 8 hours, which most people should sleep at least 8 hours, usually you've barely got like a 2-hour window between eating and, going to bed or there's just not much of a window there. And so there's some factors at play there. I would say that you would want at least kind of a 16-hour fast to really have enough compartmentalization to get something significant out of it. Now, that said, I see people go nuts and they're doing like 20 and 22-hour fast all the time. I think that that's kind of nuts also. Like it's kind of a good thing taken to an extreme. I think like 16 hours most of the time is a not bad place to be on that front.
And in terms of benefit, what would you think it would look like if I do 12-12 or if I do, 14-10 or 16-8? Where does it peak? And again, how much of a difference is there?
So this will depend a little bit on who is the person we're talking about. Like, what's their starting place? What are they trying to do? Like, is it mainly weight loss? Is it mainly improved body composition? Is it mainly improved blood glucose levels? So, starting conditions are going to be a big factor. I think that you're going to see, and also there will be a little bit of factor, just, even somebody eating between, a 16-hour fast, so like an 8-hour eating window. The one benefit there is if you eat a huge meal, in theory, you're not going to be that hungry later. Like, the food just starts kind of backing up and you're maybe not as hungry. Whereas a lot of people just kind of eat and snack morning, noon, and night, right up before bed and everything. But if we get enough of a window where things are compartmentalized, you'll see some weight loss. You'll see some metabolic improvements like cholesterol and triglycerides improving. You'll see an improvement in blood glucose level. But again, it's just so variable. Like, are we starting with somebody who is pretty metabolically healthy already, and so they just have a little ways to go? Or do we have somebody who, is super metabolically broken? And again, almost anything that we do is going to be a step in the right direction. Like, the magnitudes of response are going to be a little bit dependent on severity of the starting conditions.
Yeah, I remember Tim Ferriss interviewed Charles Poliquin, who sadly has passed away, but he was talking about training athletes, and he said some of them, like, they can have carbs and they're okay. Some of them, they can't even look at a picture of carbs because they'll gain weight. And I guess there's just such variability amongst people that, there's no absolutes is what it sounds like.
Yeah, and this is one of my ass-chapped elements of like the biohacking scene and whatnot. Like, I think that people are looking, like trying to find optimization. Like, I like that concept. I'm big into like risk reward, scenarios and stuff like that. I brew a little bit of cider, so I'm trying to optimize, inputs and outputs and all that type of jive. So I appreciate it. But when we're talking about, like health or general health topics, it's like optimizing for what exactly? If we just want to optimize for weight loss, like scale weight loss, then we may have a very different tactic than we do for just basic body composition. So like body composition, I want high protein intake. I want, resistance training, really good sleep, all that type of stuff. If all that we care about is peeling weight off of the scale, then I'm just going to starve the person, and they don't need to, necessarily resistance train, because that's just going to keep muscle mass on them. I think it would be horrible to do that, but certain actors and actresses and different scenarios like that, that's kind of called for. So optimization is so context driven. And I think so much of this stuff sorts itself out. Like, folks will do a lot of, they'll say, should I intermittent fast or not? And it's like, well, what do you want from it? Like, what's the goal? And the goal really drives that stuff. And so, if the goal is like awesome body composition, six-pack abs and everything, then it's like, okay, some intermittent fasting is going to be beneficial there. But if we're putting a premium on body composition, a good muscle mass with kind of minimized body fat levels, then a huge amount of intermittent fasting is probably going to be antithetical to that. And just because you're going to tend to lose too much muscle mass. And so it's not really improving the muscle to fat ratio in the body. So optimization is just, I think it's underappreciated. And when people enter into these discussions of health, if they would spend more time trying to delineate what it is they're trying to do, it would really help to, define the process that they're on.
Well, let's say you have someone that they want to lose weight and it's stubborn, it won't go, or their cholesterol is high and they can't get it down, or something else is going on and they just, do you find that some people need to be unbelievably strict in order to get results?
Yes and no. So like, we'll have somebody who they will say, I have a really hard time losing weight. Okay, so how buttoned up are they on their nutrition? I will promise you they're under eating protein. Like, I just guarantee it. They'll say you need to eat more protein. Well, I don't really like that stuff. I don't really care if you do or don't like it. If the goal is to, we may then get in and look at like, okay, do we have some digestive issues? Is there, Is their appetite actually underperforming for protein and stuff? But the funny thing is when people are like, oh, it's really difficult for me, I find that there's all these other knock-on considerations that are out of whack. Like they love to stay up late on their device, or they're gamers and they stay up till 2 a.m. and their sleep is terrible. It's incredibly hard, if not impossible, to get somebody to lean out when their sleep is disordered. So, it's like, is it really hard for them to lose weight, or is is the totality of their diet and lifestyle a disaster? And they just, if they're going to get anywhere near, getting to something that's going to work for them, it's just, it's going to be a bigger move than somebody who is closer to that. I don't know if this analogy works perfectly, but if somebody is wanting to make or save $1 million, but they earn $100,000 a year, but they spend $120,000 per year, that's not going to work. Like they're going to be bankrupt at some point. And I think people, get that analogy. So at some point you've got to align everything such that you're not bankrupting yourself, financially. And this is true with like health and performance-based stuff. Now, all that said, somebody who's young and active and well-rested and all that stuff, like it's definitely going to be an easier process for them to lean out versus somebody who is older and more sedentary. Like I'm almost 50. I'll be 50 in January, and I'm reasonably lean, but I have to watch things a little bit closer than what I did in the past. And the main thing is just that my life has gotten more and more sedentary, even though I work out and go to jujitsu and stuff like that. Like just my work demands are such that I don't really like hike as much as I did. I don't run around and play as much as I did. So, used to, if I needed to lose a little bit of weight, I just tightened up my food a little bit, and 4 or 5 days later, I could noticeably see a change. I have to tighten things more than that at this point because I'm a little older. My hormones are a little different, and my physical activity is just less. So I don't know if I perfectly answered that question, but I mean, there's just, there's a lot that goes into figuring out whether or not something is or isn't working, and, the how's, why's, and what's it's with.
It sounds like if people want a one-dimensional result when they go about it in a one-dimensional way, meaning like someone wants to lose weight and they just say, oh, I'm going to cut calories. It doesn't work. It sounds like this has to be multifactorial, both in the results you're looking for and in the way you go about it.
In general, yes. I mean, if the person says, I want to lose weight, and they just cut calories, that will work, assuming they continue to do it, but if they cut calories extremely, then it's going to become more difficult to adhere to it. If they cut calories too vigorously, they're going to sleep poorer. And then when you have poor sleep, the insulin resistance, kind of metabolic dysfunction from poor sleep, feeds into making that process worse. So if we have this person in the equivalent of a prison camp, like a metabolic ward prison camp, and we force them to eat less food, they're going to lose weight. But it's from a sustainability perspective, people living out in the, free living world for the most part and needing to make decisions, then you have to figure out a strategy that works. And there's usually multiple factors that we have to consider with that. Sometimes not. Some people are like, and this is where like some of the simple heuristics that I've found. Eat start your meal with protein. Eat to satiety for the most part on protein. Like eat protein till you're kind of like, okay, I'm done. Then have whatever else you want with that thing. And ideally, better choices, but protein is just kind of uniquely satiating. And so if people start with protein, they tend to do really well with that, putting some real attention towards sleep quality and duration, a good sleep hygiene, blacked out room, cool environment, all that stuff, because sleep is so important for, metabolic health and being able to lose weight. So an emphasis on good quality sleep and then eating protein first are one of these reasonably simple, tricks or hacks that I do think work over a pretty broad range of people if they're willing to give them a shot.
Yeah, I guess if people just follow that simple heuristic, eat protein first. If you can, try to eat within, an eating window, still do whatever you're doing, and then try to make sure your sleep is a bit better. That'll probably get a lot of people a long way toward better health.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's not a draconian plan. So they're probably more likely to follow it too.
Right.
What kind of people are attracted to your work? Are they the athletes that want to optimize their health to the max, or are they people that are, a mess and just want to get to be feeling better again?
Yeah, I kind of have a little bit from all of the spectrum, but I would say folks who, like, my ideal match is someone who has some complex gut issues, probably has a little bit of metabolic stuff, and they've kind of run the gamut of the standard medical scene trying to figure all that out. And, it just wasn't enough to fix what they had going on. So that's kind of that's most of the folks that end up following me. I've got some top level athletes and stuff that are kind of in the mix, but that definitely isn't my main focus.
If a person's willing and trying, honestly, is there anyone you can't help?
If they still have a pulse and they're willing to do something, but I mean, it's that readiness for change is a big, big deal. Like I've worked with a couple of billionaires and there's some really interesting people that, like, I worked with a guy who hired some of his employees to go out and get the foods that I was trying to keep out of the house. And then his wife gave me a budget to hire other employees to undermine the employees that were helping this guy. And so, like, it was crazy. Like, it was like this spy versus spy thing. It was the oddest goddamn thing I've ever done in my life. Like, this guy was 5'9", 400 pounds, having blackout sessions after eating because his vision would just be massively compromised because his blood sugars were getting into like the 400s and 500s, after meals, and he's making himself blind. So yeah, he knows he's in a disastrous situation, but he's somebody who probably has a 180 IQ, but also in some ways like the sensibilities of a spoiled child and had near infinite resources. And so he's paying me to help him, but then he's also paying people to undermine me. And then his wife is paying me additionally to pay somebody else to undermine the people that were, there was a deal where he had some of his staff drive to a Krispy Kreme, buy a bunch of donuts, get them wrapped up in a really stable bag. And then they drove by the southern edge of his property and they threw the bag of donuts over the security fence where somebody was waiting to pick it up. And then I caught wind of that and had somebody in between them, and they intercepted this thing before it made it to the house. And this was at like 2 a.m, so this guy had super disordered sleep and all this other stuff. And, cause he's this techno mogul. So can I help that guy? No, I couldn't, because he was so committed to not helping himself that then no, but anybody can change almost any situation if they're willing to make some type of a step. And sometimes the process is onerous, like it is a non-trivial thing socially to change the way that we eat. Like if you walk into your workplace and you've got the shittiest, nastiest food imaginable, hardly anybody's going to say anything. Like if you've just got like big gulps and potato chips and all this stuff, people like, okay, well, Charlie eats pretty poorly. And that's kind of the long and short of it. But if you show up at work or a family function, you're like, hey, I figured out I'm gluten intolerant and I'm eating kind of lower carbs, so this is kind of the way I'm eating. People will do everything in their power to undermine you, and ostracize you and make you feel bad for just trying to improve your situation, which again is, I've seen similar scenarios in like generationally poor families where the tendency is to overspend, max out credit cards, maybe do, some petty crime type things. And it just seems to be this multi-generational thing, but you see that like crabs pull in the crab pot, pulling folks down. So it is a non-trivial thing to change. Like shitty food is easier. It's more convenient. It tastes pretty good in the moment. It's kind of gratifying. There's a social acceptance to eating poorly that you don't find from eating well. And so there's a lot of different layers to that. Yeah.
Well, how do you tell someone to deal with those situations? I wonder if, it'd be interesting if you hired, X number of psychologists and kind of planned out maybe scripted answers that someone could use when they're around their family and they're bugging them. Or I've noticed too, if I go to a certain coffee shop I like,
and I like the person behind the counter and they're like, hey, do you want a muffin? I feel bad if I say no because I'm letting them down. I know it's ridiculous, but it's just how I feel. So I'm sure other people feel like that too.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have worked on different scripting scenarios, like, so you're going home for the holidays, and how are you going to navigate that? And sometimes you need different approaches for different people. Like if mom gets super upset because you don't eat her lasagna, but you figured out you have celiac disease, like that's just going to be a hard conversation. Or you tell mom, hey, could you make me some gluten-free lasagna with these gluten-free noodles? I love it and I would love to have it, but if I eat regular wheat, like I get sick, and you want to, you clearly don't want to make your kids sick. So there are definitely mitigating strategies around that stuff. And I do think that this is, again, where a health coach or a community helping someone through this process is really valuable, because you hit that scenario where it's like, oh, I had this kind of bump in the road. Like I went into my favorite coffee shop. They were giving out muffins or muffin samples, or they just wanted to give me one for free. And I felt really awkward turning it down. And, there are good strategies to be had with that. And it kind of varies from person to person what you're going to do. I think a lot of it is just developing some self-confidence around the thing. It's like, no, I'm good. Like I just had easy stuff. I just had a huge breakfast. I couldn't even eat another bite. So you don't even make it about me, I do or don't eat that stuff. Like there's easy outs on that stuff. Or just getting over like a stomach bug. I don't want to do anything wacky right now, and so and if you make anything about poop, people will usually leave you alone. So the stomach bug thing is a good one. It's a good get out of jail free card.
Yeah, and I also realized too, like, I've been told don't waste food, growing up. So there's all these pressures and there's all these things that maybe people are not even aware of that cause them to give in. And it makes it very hard to hold out.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting interplay there where I'm raising my kids, where I don't want them to waste food because it's money. And also they have a tendency to get distracted at meals, and then they're back in the kitchen, ruining the kitchen, like 45 minutes after we've done the proper meal and cleaned up the area and everything. So I'm like, hey, I want you to eat while we eat. But at the same time, it's like, if they're just legitimately not hungry, I don't want them to like force feed themselves. So, I mean, there's interesting trade-offs with all that for sure.
Very good. Rob, what's the best way for people to find out more? Like, how should they start their journey with you? Should they read Wired to Eat, or, what do you recommend?
I have a ton of free stuff, like at robbwolf.com. Like I have a bunch of shopping and food guides, and, how to do paleo on a budget. Like you just go there and you go to the freebies section. Like that's a super easy place to get started. I have a weekly podcast that I do with my wife called the Healthy Rebellion Radio. And that is, it goes from, very beginner to super, super in depth. Like I do generally a question and answer format where people write in questions, and I do the best I can to answer that stuff. And so, those are free and easily accessible ways to get some more information on all this.
Well, very good, Rob. You always got really interesting stories. The Doritos roulette, and now this cloak and dagger with this billionaire and the Krispy Kremes. Yeah. I really like that stuff, and I really appreciate you coming back on this podcast. And it's always good to talk to you. So thank you.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.